This video continues our discussion about verbs in English, but today we'll take a look at something called subject-verb agreement, and that means that the verb and the subject, they need to go together. And I'll show you what I mean. English really only has one verb form that's inflected for the subject, and we'll see what that is. I clean, you clean, he cleans, she cleans, it cleans, and then we have our plural subjects like we clean, plural you clean, and the third person plural, they clean. And we can see that with subjects that are third person singular like this, we use S. Now, we're still talking about Standard English, and Standard English does inflect the verbs this way, but other dialects and varieties of English do something different. So, for example, in African American English, it's very common that there's an absence of the S. So, you would have I clean, you clean, he clean, she clean, it clean, we clean, you clean, and they clean. This absence of S means that all of our verb forms look the same. There is no S. Now, there's also, it's quite possible that in some other dialects, there's a leveling. Let me write that down. Let's see. Okay, I better make a new place for that. So other dialects, in African American English again is included in this. There's something called a leveling of S to all subjects. And you can guess what that's going to look like. I cleans, you cleans, he cleans, she cleans, it cleans, we cleans, you cleans, and they cleans. We can see that all of the verb forms now take the S and go together with all of our different subjects. So this is called leveling. It becomes the same. Now there's one more example that we can give. Some dialects, like for example in the rural South, do something a little bit differently. And what they do is they only level, or not exactly level, but they add the S to the third person plural. So you get something like I clean, you clean. This is, let me put the S to third person plural. I clean, you clean, he clean, she clean, it clean, we clean, you clean, and they clean. And so sentences using this particular variety would sound like he cleaned the house in the afternoon. They clean, they cleans the house in the afternoons. So we'd only put the S on this third person. And it may sound a little bit different. We're not used to this maybe, or maybe we get certain images of the people who use this kind of dialect. But it's important for us to remember that what we're doing is we're pointing out patterns that exist in different dialects of English. And honestly, they're just as valid as the standard English pattern of adding the S on he, she, and it. So let's take a look at some more examples. Now, it's also possible that has, first, and you'll probably remember from our discussion of the irregular verbs, has is an irregular verb. It uses a different form for third person. It uses a different form in the past. And have and has also, there's something called a leveling. Let me get that down here. A leveling of has. And it's a leveling that results in something like I has a car, you has a car. We continue with he has and she has and it has, but it also levels out with we has a car, you has a car, they has a car. So this has is leveled out. And this, like I said, is part of a rural southern kind of a dialect. But also, again, we have to keep in mind that this kind of a verb behavior in the treatment of the verb is very regular. It follows a definite pattern that can be described quite easily. Now, let's continue a little bit. Let's go back and we'll look at Standard English again. In Standard English also inflects the auxiliary verb do. For example, I don't have a car. You don't need a bicycle. He doesn't smoke. She doesn't have time. It doesn't work. We don't watch much TV. Plural, you don't like coffee. They don't go to the movies. And we can see that doesn't is the inflected form of don't, and it goes together with subjects like he, she, it, or any subject that can be replaced with he, like John or Mary or the car for it. But now there is a leveling in certain dialects, and actually many vernaculars. It's not just in the South or African American English or California, but many vernaculars, and probably, I'm sure that you've heard this one. There's a leveling of don't, or a leveling to don't. I don't, you don't, and now here we see it. He don't, she don't, it don't. And this is, you can really hear this in country music. He don't love her anymore. She don't want to take him back. it don't look right. But basically, we've gotten this, vernaculars are tending to drop this doesn't, the inflected form, and level out with don't. We don't want, you don't want, they don't want. And we can see, we often hear, oh, this is bad English, it's incorrect. But it's really not. It's not the way we do it in standard English, but it is the way we do it when we're speaking of vernacular. And that's the important thing to remember, that what we're talking about is really a rule-governed behavior. It's some way that language works. So let's continue a little bit more. Now, that was the verbs. But also there's a very special verb in English, and you know which one I'm talking about already, and it's the most irregular verb we have. It's be. And we already know in standard English how it looks, how it conjugates if you want, how it looks when it's inflected. I am thirsty. You are watching this video. He is sitting near the refrigerator. She is from Washington. It is next to the door. We are home. You are home. And they are leaving. And we can see how am, are, is, it really changes as it goes together with different subjects. And that's the perfect example of subject-verb agreement. Now, what I do want to say is that vernaculars don't necessarily do this. And some vernaculars, again, there's a leveling to is. And let's see how this looks. I is thirsty. You is watching. And we continue with he is sitting. She is from Washington. It is next to you. But we is home. You is home. And they is leaving. We can see how is has been leveled across all subjects. Now, of course, be also has verb-subject agreement or subject-verb agreement in the past. For example, I was at home. You were with me. He was using the car. She was working. It was on the table. In the plurals, we were busy. You are in a hurry. They are standing near the door. But again, vernaculars, and many vernaculars, level this to was. There's a leveling to was. We don't see it immediately. It's still I was. But now it's you was home. He remains the same. He was. She was. It was. But this leveling affects our plural subjects. We was in the kitchen. You was waiting for us. And they was by the door. Now, I don't know why I did this. This should be you were and they were, because this was the past example we wanted to show. So we can see that in the present, when you have be in standard American English, am, are, is, but in vernaculars, there's a leveling to is. In the past, in standard English, we have was and were tying and agreeing with different subjects. But in vernaculars, very often there's a leveling to was. We use the same was to agree with all subjects. All right. Now, in the past, let's see, let me just fix my papers here. In the past, there's also agreement, of course, in standard English with negatives. For example, I wasn't home. You weren't home. He wasn't watching TV. She wasn't working. It wasn't mine. And then we weren't. You weren't. They weren't. And we can see this subject-verb agreement. But let's take a look what happens in many vernaculars. So in many vernaculars, there's again a leveling. So in the affirmative, we saw that the leveling went to was. I was, you was, he was, she was, it was, you were, we was, they was. But with negative, it's a little bit different. The leveling goes to weren't. So for example, I weren't at home. You weren't with me. He weren't working. She weren't busy. It weren't open. We weren't there. You weren't free. And they weren't standing by the door. So we see that there's a leveling in the vernaculars when we use the negative be in the past. Now, we do have one more topic to talk about with verb-subject and subject-verb agreement. And again, there is a difference between standard English and vernaculars. Now, first of all, let me just introduce this idea of calling something the existential there. Now, what does that mean exactly? It means that when you're using existential there, the sentence relates to either existence or location. For example, let me give you an example here. There is a cup on the table. I'm talking about the location of an object. Now, you know I'm talking about location because I'm using this existential air. And excuse me. And because this is talking about location, this is called locative. And locative refers to location. Now, there is another way, like I said, when you use there, it can either be about location or existence. So, for example, I can also say, there is a supermarket near my house. Maybe this does feel a little bit like location, but I'm really thinking about just the existence of this market. But I could use a different example and say, there is a problem with my camera. What I'm really saying is there's the existence of a problem, or a problem exists. And we can see that these sentences, we can change them to plural. For example, there is a cup of coffee on the table, or there is a cup on the table is singular, but I can make it plural by saying there are cups on the table. Here we have plural. I can also say there are many problems with my camera. And standard English does make a difference. It does have, you can see, there must be some kind of agreement going on here. But it looks like the subject is the same. And this is what I'd like to say, is that in an existential there sentence, the real subject of that sentence is actually the noun phrase that follows there. So these noun phrases, excuse me, are the real subjects of these sentences, and so we can see that there is agreement. A cup is it is, a supermarket is, excuse me, cups are, problems are, and in fact, we can rewrite these sentences a little bit differently. So we can rewrite the sentences to make them look like this. A cup is on the table. My camera okay, that's not going to work. But I could say a supermarket is nearby. I can say cups are on the table. And the important thing is that this really shows us this subject-verb agreement. But now there is a trend, and this I think is kind of interesting. There's a trend in vernaculars to get rid of this kind of subject-verb agreement, and there's, of course, what we call a leveling. And the leveling, and I'm sure you know this, goes towards is. There's a leveling to is. So today, it's so common to hear there's a cup on the table and there's cups on the table. There's a problem with my camera, and we also hear all the time there's many problems with my camera. So we have a leveling in these existential there sentences to the S form, is. And not only is vernacular English doing this, but we can find standard English is also moving in this same direction of leveling to is. So this concludes our video about subject-verb agreement in English, and the same topics we can see when we talk about vernaculars. Again, the important thing to keep in mind is that when we describe a vernacular's use of verbs, or when we describe the use of standard English, all of these uses follow very regular patterns in descriptions. I hope you've enjoyed this information. I've enjoyed sharing it with you, and we'll continue.